Today I'm going to start the form validation module. So you go here on HTML, Forms, Form Validation. Introduction to HTML Form Validation. Ever wonder how a login page actually works or why the combination of a username and password grants your access to a website? The answer lay in validation. Validation is the concept of checking user-provided data against the required data. Validation is the concept of checking user-provided data against the required data. There are different types of validation. One type is server-side validation. This happens when data is sent to another machine, typically a server, for validation. An example of this type of validation is the usage of a login page. The form on the login page accepts username and password input, then sends the data to a server that checks that the pair matches up correctly. On the other hand, we use client-side validation if we want to check the data on the browser, the client. This validation occurs before data is sent to the different browsers implement client-side validation differently, but it leads to the same outcome. Shared among the different browsers are the benefit of using HTML5 built-in client-side validation. It saves us time from having to send information to a server and wait for the server to send back confirmation or rejection of the data. This can also help us protect our server from malicious code or data from malicious user. It also allows us to quickly give feedback to users for specific fields rather than having them fill in a form again if the data they input into the form was rejected. In this lesson, we'll learn how to add some validation checks to our forms. Requiring an input. Requiring an input. Sometimes we have fields in our forms which are not optional. There must be information provided before we can submit it. To enforce this rule, we can add the required attribute to an input element. For example, you have here a form, label, there is input ID allergies, name allergies, type text, required. This renders a text box. If we try to submit the form without filling out, we get this message. Please fill out this field. This styling of message varies from browser to browser. The picture above depicts the message in a Chrome browser. We will also continue to show these messages as they appear in Chrome in later exercises. So the exercise currently in the provided form, the user can submit it without putting any values inside the input field. Let's change that by adding a required attribute to the existing input. After you clear this checkpoint, try submitting the form without filling out the fields. So there it is. We'll add to the input required. Let's try submit. And we get the message, please fill out this field. Set a minimum and a maximum. Another built-in validation we can use is to assign a minimum and maximum value for a number field. We can use input type number and input type range. To set a minimum acceptable value, use the minimum attribute to assign a value. On the flip side, to set a maximum acceptable value, we assign the max attribute a value. Let's see this code. Have here type number, minimum 1, maximum 4. If a user tries to submit an input that is less than 1, a warning will appear. Value must be greater than or equal to 1. And a similar message will appear if a user tries to input a number greater than 4. So here in the exercise, they're asking to set to a minimum of 1, max of 10. So let's try 11, and we get the message. Value must be less than or equal to 10. It works. Checking text length. To set a minimum number of characters for a text field, we add the min length, and to set a max, we use max length. So here in this code, if a user tries to submit the form with less than the set minimum, this message appears. Please length this text to 5 characters or more. You're currently using 2 characters. So in this exercise, we're going to set a min length and a max length of 3 and 15 for the username. So there it is, min length 3, max length 15 on the input for ID username. Let's try just 2 characters. And we get the message that we're currently using only 2 characters and there's a minimum of 3. Matching a pattern. In addition to checking the length of a text, we can also add a validation to check how the text was provided. For cases when we want user input to follow specific guidelines, we use the pattern attribute and assign it a regular expression. Regular expressions are a sequence of characters that make up a search pattern. If the input matches the regular expression, the form can be submitted. Let's say we wanted to check for a valid credit card number, a 14 to 16 digit number. We can use the regular expression 0 to 9, 14 to 16, which checks that the user provided only numbers and that they enter at least 14 digits and at most 16 digits. To add this to a form, you're going to add on the input after the type text, required pattern 0 to 9, 14 to 16. With the pattern in place, users cannot submit the form with a number that doesn't follow the regular expression. When they try, they'll see a validation message like so. Please match the request format. We might also want to limit usernames to only letters and numbers and not special characters like exclamation point or @. To add this validation, add a pattern attribute to set it to AZ00 through 9 in the first input element. So there it is. So this is the review. So this is everything we learned in this module. Client-side validation happens in the browser before information is sent to a server. Adding the required attribute to an input relay elements will validate that the input field has information in it. Assigning a value to the min attribute of a number input element will validate an acceptable minimum value. Assigning a value to the max attribute of a number input element will validate an acceptable max value. Assigning minimum length and max length will attribute a minimum and max length to the text. Assigning regex to pattern match the input to the provided regex. If validation on a form do not pass, the user gets a message explaining why and the form cannot be submitted.